What is spirit-empowered leadership? This is the question that I've been asking in discussions about leadership. Leadership is very important within not only the business world, but it's a conversation that has entered the church. And for the last few decades, there's been a lot of discussion about the nature of leadership related to Christian spirituality and church leadership. And so a couple of years back, I did a literature review on asking the question, what are individuals and scholars in the spirit-empowered movement saying about leadership? So the spirit-empowered movement represents the Pentecostal and charismatic movement globally, numbering around 644 million adherents in different denominations and independent networks and such. And so the idea of a spirit-empowered leader, obviously leadership is very important to a growing movement like the spirit-empowered movement. And so I wanted to get to the bottom of the question, what is our community, our spirit-empowered community saying about leadership, and what might be those distinctives that are coming out of our movement to talk about what it is that we mean by spirit-empowered leadership. And so I decided to do a literature review back in 2020, and I published that literature review in Spiritus, the ORU Journal of Theology. What we're asking is, what are those sort of distinctive characteristics that flow out of our distinctive theological tradition? So the spirit-empowered tradition has already embedded in it an emphasis on the Holy Spirit, and that Holy Spirit has a functional way in which the Spirit works within leaders. And so we talk about gifts of the Spirit and healing and Spirit baptism and speaking in tongues, and all of these things are related to sort of the functional nature of the Holy Spirit within us. And so in what way does that functionality operate within the leader as opposed to just the minister? So this is the next problem that comes about when you look at leadership within the spirit-empowered tradition. So most of the church leadership books who talk about spirit-empowered leadership are doing so from a church standpoint, meaning how to lead a congregation or how to pastor a congregation. And while that's good, it's somewhat limited in its contextualization because it's really only talking about leadership in relationship to the church itself. But we believe that the Holy Spirit can empower leaders in every person's world. So any position, any sphere and realm in which people are operating, they can operate in the Holy Spirit's giftings and leadership within those contexts. It doesn't have to just be the church or ministry. So this article then recognized that spirit-empowered leadership is really still emerging as a concept. And Pentecostals, though we're strong on leadership, we haven't thought really in depth about what makes that leadership unique to us as a Holy Spirit movement. And so while this is not intended necessarily to be fully descriptive, nor does it identify every single element. I think there's a lot more work to do. I want to identify today these sort of unique characteristics, 5 of them that represent the spirit-empowered model of leadership, meaning if we're to say, what does a spirit-empowered leader look like? I found these 5 sort of common characteristics across these studies. The first one is that of a spirit-filled leader. So spirit-empowered leadership really begins out of the spiritual life of the leader themselves. And so for us as spirit-empowered believers, we believe that leadership is not really a position, it's an experience of the Holy Spirit. So being filled with the Holy Spirit, being empowered by the Holy Spirit is the starting point for all leadership. For us as a tradition, it's often sort of a qualification for ministry, for ordination. And so we recognize beginning, the first characteristic of a spirit-empowered leader is one who's had the experience of being spirit-empowered. And so before we can become leaders, we must be that personally. And so it's out of that deep spiritual life that the dynamic relationship between the person and the Holy Spirit is nurtured. And so that's where leadership begins. It's about developing ourselves as Pentecostal and charismatic believers, not by our beliefs, but by the actual experience of the Spirit. And that experience of the Spirit is not just due the gifts of the Spirit, which certainly is the first part of how we recognize those sort of leadership giftings, is the giftings that come with leadership. But it's also the fruit of the Spirit. So whether you're leading a church of 50 or you're leading a Fortune 500 company, Spirit-filled leaders should always look at themselves as first Spirit-filled people and should never divorce their spirituality from their vocation. So we can see everything we do in light of ourselves as a Spirit-empowered believer. So leadership development then is about spiritual development as much as it is about leadership capacity. Now, the second concept that I saw across these studies that I looked at was that the Spirit-empowered believer, one of the unique characteristics is being Spirit dependent, meaning for us as a movement, our whole concept as a Christian community is focused on the Holy Spirit. And the leader, therefore, reflects that. We are really Spirit people. And so we recognize that Spirit is not necessarily our tool that we use, but the Holy Spirit, we're dependent upon the Holy Spirit for everything that we do. So we see the Spirit as the Spirit of truth. We see the Spirit as an advocate on our behalf. We see the Spirit as the one who leads us and guides us. The Spirit gives us wisdom, gives us knowledge, all of these embedded sort of dependencies on the Holy Spirit. So in leadership, then, I think a Spirit-empowered leader is really one who is the ability to depend upon the Holy Spirit for their leadership. So education has a role, and insights have a role, and experience has a role. But the Spirit-empowered leader brings to it more than those things, brings the dependency that the Holy Spirit is leading me. And so therefore I can lead others. The third characteristic is that of a Spirit-moved leader. Now, what I mean by that is that we recognize that the Holy Spirit is not an abstract concept, but the Holy Spirit is actually moving us and leading us as people. And so for the leader, we recognize that because the Spirit moves, that we are always moving as well. So the Spirit-empowered leader then has the ability to embrace change and adapt because we are already trained by the Spirit to follow. And so this means that Spirit-empowered leaders are nimble and adapt very easily. I think we take seriously the idea that we're most effective when we're the most moved by the Spirit, meaning we move in pace with, or as Paul said, to keep in step with the Spirit. And so Spirit-empowered leaders really rely upon the Spirit to help move them and shape them and are flexible. So we have the ability as Spirit-empowered leaders to be able to change and grow by nature because we're already allowing the Holy Spirit to do that in our lives. Now, the fourth competency is that of a Spirit-gifted leader. So now, of course, we Spirit-empowered leaders, we already recognize the role of gifts, right? The gifts are the tools in which the Holy Spirit gives us to be able to minister effectively within the church. But I think as a leadership competency, we also recognize that there are certain people who are just gifted, right? So the giftings of the person make them a good leader. So they might have a strong gift of administration or visionary, or perhaps they're wise. And all of these we recognize are just gifts of the Holy Spirit that are coming through within the natural personality. But a Spirit-empowered leader is really a Spirit-gifted leader, meaning What we're saying is those gifts of vision and leadership and things like that are really not ours to begin with. They are really a bestowal of the Spirit. The Spirit gifts them to us. And so we are used by the Spirit as much as we are perhaps seeing it as a gift we're using. So the leader then is always looking for the giftings of the Spirit in themselves, but also in others. So this kind of leadership then says that the Holy Spirit is using people, and that using people is not always just the people on the top. In fact, I believe a spirit-empowered leader recognizes the giftings in others and draws from that the Holy Spirit is using them as much as the Spirit is using me as a leader. So it flips the process of leadership on its head. It's saying, I'm here to recognize what the Spirit is doing in you and give you a platform to be able to bring that out. And so this attitude of service towards the team means that the leader's job is to cultivate the led, to bring the giftings of the led out, to celebrate those people that they're leading and the way in which the Spirit is leading them as part of this whole concept. So a leader then is great because the people they lead are great. Or a leader is gifted if they allow the gifted people they lead to operate correctly. So this community-dependent sort of model is what a gifted spirit-empowered leader. It's not just about the leader's gifts, but about the leader's ability to draw out the gifts in others. And finally, the fifth one is a spirit-confident leader. And so a spirit-empowered leader then is an assertive leader who takes a God-given initiatives under their wing because they believe they're led to do so. So we talk about faith within the Christian tradition, and in our movement, we talk about faith. It's that faith is the belief that God can do that. In the spiritual gifts, faith is mentioned as that supernatural ability to believe that something is possible. And I believe that's a characteristic of spirit-empowered leaders, that they are spirit confident, that they see big problems, but they also see big answers because they have a big God who's inspiring them with faith to go conquer those problems. So it's the Spirit's ability then to take just an ordinary person like you and me and to create that sense of faith that we could do something about that. So an assertive leader then has that faith, but it also is a faith of the Spirit, meaning that the Spirit is always tempering that with the fruit of the Spirit and with the sanctification of the Spirit. So we never allow that faith to put us on a pedestal above anybody else. We're confident, but we're not confident in ourselves. We're confident in God by the Spirit. So it's that ability to see something as possible because the Spirit has empowered us to see that. And not just because we're optimistic or we're arrogant or we're assertive, but that the Spirit is giving us those. So these 5 characteristics. The first, a spirit-filled leader. It flows out of the deep spirituality we have. The second, a spirit-dependent leader, meaning we orient all of our leadership in a dependency on the Spirit. The third is the spirit-moved leader, meaning that we're used to the idea that the Spirit can move and change us and adapt us. We're gifted leaders in that spirit-empowered leaders see the giftings in ourselves and draw the gifting out of others. And then spirit confident leaders, meaning we have the faith to believe that change can come and that every problem can be addressed because the Spirit gives us that. So I think in all of that, I think what we're beginning to see then is that the Holy Spirit does make a difference in our leadership when the Holy Spirit is prioritized. And I think that truly is the heart of spirit-empowered leadership, is that prioritization of the Spirit. And we recognize as a movement that that prioritization is something that empowers across the board, meaning we believe that all the global movement of the Spirit is inclusive. the Spirit pours out on all flesh. And so people across contexts and male and female and ethnicities, everyone is invited into that place of leadership. But also we see it within organizations that because the Holy Spirit pours out on all flesh, we recognize that hierarchy falls to the wayside within that. Because now, just like in the church where the Holy Spirit empowers the individuals to express spiritual gifts within the context of the church, that also within the organizations, that from the bottom up, the Spirit can be using all of us to impact and lead within an organization. So I think this is really the central piece of what it means to be a Spirit-empowered leadership, is it means to be somebody who's prioritized the Holy Spirit and begins to look at how the Spirit is moving in my leadership, not just what skills and knowledge and competencies I've gained. So I think that's one of the distinctives that we have to offer. And I hope these 5 concepts help to think about how our movement is contributing to this large field of leadership. That these competencies, sometimes even going against the conventional wisdom of the world, is really how Spirit-empowered leaders are leading out and making a difference in that generation. I hope you enjoy that. If you want to check out that article, it's Spiritus. You can go to spiritus.oru.edu and look at the 2020 edition on Spirit-empowered leadership.